Reflecting on my childhood always stirs a mixture of emotions. Memories of simple joys, innocent adventures, and, occasionally, the kind of fear that only a child's imagination can conjure. One particular incident from when I was 4 stands out with unnerving clarity, haunting me even now as an adult. It all began with a gift from my Aunt Mary, a brown ragdoll rabbit I named Muppie. Aunt Mary was a kind, gentle woman with an uncanny talent for crafting. Her creations were whimsical, imbued with the rustic charm that only handmade toys possess. When she presented Muppie to me, I was instantly captivated. The rabbit had long floppy ears and a buttoned-up shirt that matched his brown fur, and little shoes with laces. Its face was adorned with 2 round buttons for eyes, a soft pink triangle for a nose, and a stitched-on smile. I loved Muppie at first sight, and placed him on a shelf above my bed where he could watch over me as I slept. For the first time in weeks, Muppie was a constant companion. I took him everywhere, and he was always by my side. But then, strange things started happening. It began with the nightlight. Every morning I found it unplugged, even though I distinctly remember my father plugging it in before he left my room at night. The door, which I always closed tightly, was often cracked open when I awoke. I was a meticulous child, particular about my routine, so these changes unsettled me. One night, I woke to find my door ajar and Muppie missing from his shelf. Panic set in as I scanned the room, my eyes darting around in a dim light. Muppie was nowhere to be found, nowhere to be seen. Then I heard it, the faint sound of movement coming from the bathroom across the hall. Gathering all the courage my 4-year-old self could muster, I crept out of bed and tiptoed to the bathroom door. Pressing my ear against the cool wood, I listened. The noises were subtle, rustling, a soft thud, the faint sound of something scraping against the tiles. Summoning my bravery, I slowly pushed the door open, the hinges groaning in protest. The sound ceased immediately, plunging the house into an eerie silence. My eyes strained in the darkness, but the moonlight streaming through the bathroom window cast enough light to see the small, shadowy figure inside. Its ears were long and unmistakable. Heart pounding, I bolted back to my room, diving under the covers. I lay there, trembling, listening intently. Moments later, I heard my door click shut. When I finally dared to peek out from underneath the blanket, Muppie was back on the shelf, sitting exactly where I had left him. The incident left me shaken, but I was afraid to tell my parents. I doubted they would believe me. The next morning, my parents were livid. The bathroom was a disaster. Toothpaste smeared across the sink and mirror, toilet paper unraveled into a messy heap on the floor, and several bottles of medication emptied. They accused me of causing this chaos, but I swore it wasn't me.
It was Muppie,
I insisted, my voice quivering. They dismissed my explanation as childish nonsense and scolded me harshly. That night, after my father tucked me in and plugged in my nightlight, I stared at Muppie, his button eyes gleaming ominously in the soft glow. Sleep came reluctantly, and when it did, it was filled with restless dreams. I was jolted awake by something heavy falling on my bed beside me. My heart raced as I opened my eyes to find Muppie lying beside me. In a panic, I kicked him off the bed, hearing the soft thud as he hit the floor. It took me a few moments to gather the courage to lean over and check to see where Muppie had landed, To my horror, he wasn't there. Before I could react, I felt a forceful shove behind me, sending me tumbling out of bed and onto the hard floor. Pain shot through my nose as I landed face first, and I could feel the warm trickle of blood. Screaming, I ran from my room and to my parents' bedroom, blood dripping from my upper lip. They were shocked by my appearance, but despite my frantic explanations, they remained skeptical.
Muppie did it.
I repeated, tears streaming down my face. They related it to my overactive imagination and stress of recent changes in our family. The days that followed were a blur of fear and confusion. I avoided Muppie as much as possible, leaving him on the shelf and refusing to touch him. But his presence loomed over me, a constant reminder of the terror I felt. My parents grew increasingly frustrated with what they perceived as my misbehavior or wild stories. One evening, Aunt Mary visited. She noticed my distress and took me aside, asking gently what was wrong. Through sobs, I recounted the events that had transpired. Her expression shifted from concern to something else, something I couldn't quite decipher. With a soft sigh, she took Muppie from the shelf and examined him closely.
I think it's time you knew a little more about Muppie,
she said, her voice tinged with sadness. She pointed to the buttons on his face.
These buttons came from an old jacket. It belonged to my ex-husband, Henry.
A shiver ran down my spine at the mention of Henry. Though I had never met him, I had overheard enough hushed conversations to know he wasn't a kind man. Aunt Mary continued, her voice barely above a whisper.
Henry wasn't a nice person, and his spirit, well, let's just say it didn't find peace easily.
She turned toward me, her expression softening. With a determined look, she grabbed a pair of scissors from her bag and swiftly snipped off Muppie's button eyes. The tiny white circles clinked softly as she tossed him in the trash.
There,
she said, smoothing out the fabric where his eyes once were.
Now, Muppie won't trouble you anymore.
She then placed the eyeless Muppie back on the shelf and hugged me gently.
Things will be fine from now on,
she whispered before leaving the room. To my surprise, Aunt Mary was right. For an entire week, there were no more incidents. The nightlight stayed plugged in, the door remained closed, and I slept soundly. It was the most peace I'd felt in weeks, and I began to believe that the worst was behind me. But then, one evening, just as I was starting to let my guard down, my father came in to tuck me into bed. He smiled warmly as he handed me something soft. My heart stopped when I realized it was Muppie, his button eyes securely sewn back on.
I found these in the trash,
Dad said, unaware of the panic rising in my chest.
Your mother sewed it back on. All better now.
I stared at Muppie, his button eyes gleaming in the dim light, and a chill crept down my spine. After a moment, my father placed Muppie on the shelf right where he used to sit and gently closed the door. Before the door latch clicked, I heard my father whisper, "Good night." I couldn't sleep. I lay there for hours, staring at Muppie from the safety of my bed. His button eyes seemed to stare back, gleaming darkly in the soft glow of the nightlight. Exhaustion finally took over, and I drifted off, though not without fear lingering in my chest. But sleep didn't last long. I was startled awake by a soft thud from a corner. My heart pounded as I looked toward the shelf where Muppie had been placed. He was gone. Panic gripped me as I sat up, scanning the room for any sign of the ragdoll rabbit. My breath caught in my throat as, without warning, my nightlight flickered and went out, plunging me into complete darkness. Looking back, I realized that sometimes things we fear as children are not just figments of our imagination. Sometimes they are far more real and far more terrifying than we could ever comprehend. We hope you enjoyed the story. Stay safe and remember, the scariest stories are the ones we live through. Until next time.